Hello and welcome to Redlining Anderson. This is the channel where we talk about economic, financial, and historical things in simple terms. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the gentrification of Seattle. When you finish this video, you'll be able to go on to YouTube and look at a lot of the videos that talk specifically on what is going on in Seattle as of right now. But this video is dedicated to how it got so bad in Seattle with gentrification. You need to subscribe to the video. There's a lot more stuff like this coming, so hit the subscribe button. Now, what is gentrification? Gentrification is when one class of people replaces another class of people for economic needs. It comes from an old French term called gentry. And gentry is just a class of people who fell in between, they're the artisans. They fell in between the poor people and the aristocracy. You must destroy it before you can gentrify. And there were tools that they all used. One is called redlining, where they restrict the amount of loans. They actually use color-coded things to restrict the amount of loans on maps to certain areas. Reduction of services is another tool you use to gentrify. No safety, police, food, pharmacy disappear, food deserts, blockbusting, where it was not unheard of for a realtor to hire a black lady to walk down the white street with a carriage to scare people, or for someone to call up a white home and ask for someone with a black name. Crimes, drugs. There's a rent gap theory that gentrifies where it's not worth even to pay the taxes for a landowner or an owner of a house. It's easier to walk away. There are tax abatements for developers that somehow never seem to work out. And there's restrictive covenants, which is if you own a home, look at your title. It is possible you may have a restrictive covenant in your title. And a restrictive covenant just basically defines who you can sell that property to. Although they are not active and enforceable since the Federal Housing Act of 1968, they are still in the contracts. Okay. Seattle was a city of bust and boom. It was founded in 1851, incorporated in 1869, and it was called the waterway to the world. Seattle, in its infancy, was a town that was known as a logging town, but coming with all the men there was the prostitution, the gambling, the drinking, and all the man type stuff. In 1869, a gentleman named Harvey Pike had an idea. He was inspired by the Erie Canal system in New York. And what he saw in Puget Sound and what he saw is the possibility of building a tremendous system of canals to move Seattle into the game. So, moving on, in later that, toward the end of the century, Jacktown was formed in Seattle. There was, Seattle had one of the largest, I believe the largest Japanese population outside of San Francisco. It also had a huge Chinese population within railroads and shipyards. By 1862, the Land Grant Act was issued and white Americans were able to, through manifest destiny, move west and occupy lands if they improved the lands. The Morrill Act also came allowing schools to be built out in the Midwest. Black people were excluded from that. In 1890, the population of Seattle was 45,000, and by 1910, it was much, much higher than that. The Klondike gold rush encourage people to come. The people in Seattle at that time were Irish, Chinese, Japanese, Germans, Italians, and some blacks. But the problem again was insufficient housing. There was no housing to fit all these people coming to Seattle for work. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act came, which banned Chinese from coming to the United States for 10 years. There was a great Seattle fire in 1889, which gave the opportunity to rebuild Seattle. The 20th century for Seattle was known as a shipping, lumber, seaport, agriculture, and petroleum environment. By World War II, 3 million soldiers were off fighting in Europe and in Japan. And the United States, World War II, were fighting in Japan. And the plan was now they had to bring in people to work to fill the jobs that these people had before. There was a base that was built in in Seattle before then called Fort Lewis. Fort Lewis became McCord Air Force Base because of its deep water ports and access to transportation. So by 1934, the FHA was involved. They issued what was called redlining, where certain areas were restricted to getting certain funds based upon race. World War II, bordered on the Japanese internment camps. That was between the bombing of Pearl Harbor and 1945. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese were moved from Seattle and displaced. They were put into barbed wire camps with armed guards. They had 6 days to sell everything they owned, and they lost everything. And they sold their businesses for pennies on a dollar. When they returned, there was nothing left. It was all gone. In 1988, President Reagan felt he made restitution by issuing $20,000 to every living person that experienced that. So if you had died before 1988, you got nothing. Housing was still a huge problem. Asians and blacks had a very hard time finding homes in Seattle. Boeing eventually comes. They seal a deal with the Seattle Land Company to build housing for their people, and it had big restrictions on blacks and Asians. Well, there was, again, very few houses built between 1930 and 1950. And by 1948, the urban renewal and eminent domain was huge. The government just seized property from people to build highways. That time, the great migration of blacks came north again. The second and much more serious devastation of the communities came by the National Defense and Highway Act by Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956, where over 40,000 miles of highway was built, devastating communities all over the country. It's called Transitoriented gentrification. White flight occurred by the 70s. Portland was defunct. By 2008, with the housing crisis, you had people, mainly minorities, who found themselves upside down because they had taken variable interest rates and got crushed. Then you had COVID. What we are seeing now in Seattle is a great deal of the tracts have now been gentrified. mainly in the central district. But let me tell you, take a look at a video called On the Brink. That should be a next step after this. This will give you an idea on what it's like in Seattle at present in the Central District. I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd like you to make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss anything. And have a good day.